Your studio is probably lying to you. I already made a video about this in the past. Your speakers may be sending out a perfectly flat signal, but reflections and bass buildups are probably wreaking havoc on what you actually hear, muddying up your mix and making it hard to make mixes that translate to other environments. Studio acoustic treatment is highly recommended. However, the amount of thick absorbing material you need to prevent bass buildups, especially in relatively small square rooms like mine, would take up way too much space. I discussed a few solutions to this in my video. The cheapest is probably just to mix with headphones or minimize the problem with room correction software that creates an EQ curve that's opposite to the problems in your room. The software room correction solutions that I show in that video work well, and the biggest pro for them is cost and the fact that you don't need to replace your speakers, but they do have a few limitations. The biggest issue is, by definition, when you use software, you've got to run your audio through a computer. So if you have a hardware-based setup, you'll need to route audio through a computer and apply the software correction to that audio. Then a secondary issue is, even if you're only using a computer, a plugin based solution means you can only apply correction inside your DAW, not to audio coming out any other app. Now, SonarWorks does have a system-wide component, but that introduces latency if you want to work at the highest quality level and still doesn't solve the problem for a hardware instrument-based setup going through an audio interface or mixer. Then the final bit of annoyance with a plugin based solution is that you need to remember to take it off your master before you export. Since I mostly make music on hardware setups, when IK Multimedia reached out and offered to send over their Precision MTMs for review, which have built-in hardware room correction, I was intrigued. Speaking of disclosures, no money changed hands, and IK Multimedia have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. Before we take a look and listen to how they perform, I'll quickly cover what else is inside the box. Aside from the speakers, you get a measuring microphone and clamp. There's one of this and this in each of the speaker boxes, so a bit of redundancy there. You also get 4 little isolation pucks you can put under the speakers to help isolate their vibrations from your desk. I've got the speakers here on IsoAcoustics stands, hopefully for even better isolation, but more importantly, so that the tweeter is at ear level. To calibrate the speakers to your room, you need to connect the measuring microphone directly to each of the speakers individually with an XLR cable that doesn't come included in the box, so you'll need to buy one. They go for about $10 on Amazon. The MTMs themselves have 2 5-inch woofers and a single textile dome tweeter. The bass ports are on the back. It's worth noting that IK Multimedia also make 2 other less expensive versions of these speakers with 1 woofer and 1 tweeter, the Precision 5 and Precision 6, with the same DSP and correction specs, just different woofer options. On the back of the speaker are a combo XLR/1/4-inch audio input, an AC power jack, and an on-off switch, though the speakers support auto standby. There's a level control knob with a center detent for 0, a USB port in case you do want to connect the speakers to a computer for use with the X Monitor software, and an input and daisy chain pass-through for the optional remote control. Aside from the auto standby control, you have 4 buttons for various frequency controls, though the star of the show is the calibration button, which lets you toggle between 2 presets, flat and desk, and a third calibrated option where the speakers adapt to the flaws in your room. A long press on this button starts the calibration process, which we'll talk about in a bit, but it's easier to just start it with the software. Beyond the relatively coarse EQ control for the speakers, you can also control and configure them using the X Monitor software, and this gives you additional controls that you don't have in the back. Aside from the speakers, you can also buy an optional wired remote control, which has 2 purposes. First, for quick access to 4 speaker calibration options, and it can be also customized to do a few other things. And the second use for this is to assist in the calibration of the speakers if you don't have a computer with the software around to let you step between the 4 measuring points. We'll see that in a bit. You can also step between the 4 measuring points using the buttons in the back of the speaker, but obviously having this is more convenient. That said, again, you can do everything with the software too. Configuring what these 4 buttons do in the software is pretty easy. You just right-click on any of the buttons, any button you want to change, and then choose one of the options, and it's basically configured for it. If I turn this off, you can see how the different EQ curves change. For example, I'll put this back on smartphone. That's a pretty aggressive smartphone curve. The remote comes with 2 long TRS cables. You connect it to the remote in port of one of the speakers, and then the second TRS cable to the other speaker. Okay, let's see how getting up and running with calibration actually works. You can start the speaker calibration process either using a computer or without one with a long press on the cal/preset button for 3 seconds. Like I mentioned, you don't really need to reach behind the back or use the remote if you've got a computer connected to both speakers via USB. Getting going with the software is really easy. There's a wizard that takes you through the process. You need to take 4 measurements around where you believe your head will be spending most of its time. The mic needs to be on a stand at ear level with the LED pointing up. And when you start the process, you'll hear a few sweeps play back. It takes a few seconds for them to play back and then a few seconds for the algorithm to do its thing, I guess. Keep doing that for all 4 locations, making sure there are no other noises in your room. Once the sweeps in 4 locations have been saved, the speaker will spend a few more seconds processing the information, and then you're good to go for the 1 speaker. You then need to repeat the whole process again for the 2nd speaker. The whole process takes under 2 minutes per speaker, which is great compared to some of the software solutions out there. I don't know why, by the way, for the hardware it's so quick, but it's great that it is. Since the calibration profiles are stored in the hardware, once you've completed the calibration of both speakers, there's no need to have the computer on or the software running. The correction curve is burned into the speakers, and you can turn correction on or off using the remote or the button on the back of the speakers. So does it work? Let's first take a look at the X-Monitor software. It shows you a sweep of your room before correction for each of the speakers. You can see the difference, by the way. Literally off the charts here, this bass mode. For each of the speakers, left and right, and then it shows you a calculation of what it anticipates the curve to be after correction. So quite an ambitiously flat curve here. Let's see if it holds up in the real world. To check if it really works this well, I ran a sweep of my room using Room EQ Wizard, and these are the results. So as you can see in the before, quite a difference between the highs and the lows on this chart. And if we go into the post-arc corrected sweep, levels pick up at about 45 Hertz, which is pretty much the spec of the speaker. And then if we look at sort of, say, the average height over here, we're getting a maximum of 94, minimum of maybe 89. So 5 dB plus and minus up until 10 kilohertz. Then it starts to drop at 13 or 14. So not too bad at all. So we're looking at a total from extreme to extreme, about maybe 5 dB compared to, what was this? 105 down to 89. That's about a 16 dB difference. So if we look at them both, significantly flatter. Setting aside the charts, the difference in sound I think is remarkable. I played quite a bit of music through these speakers. Turning room correction on just lifts a cloud of mud off the lows and mid and removes a lot of pressure built up in the room. So they do a great job. And again, regardless of these speakers, watch my other video. If your room isn't treated, use either software or hardware to try and fix it as much as possible. It really works. Let's maybe take a bit of a deeper look at the X-Monitor software. It's fairly straightforward and easy to use. We talked about the before and after curves. You'll probably want to have the speakers linked, but you can unlink them if you want. You can target a few contours, and you can also edit those if you like. Edit the standby timers and delay if you want. And then, like I mentioned, you use this to configure what each of the hardware buttons or these buttons do. And this section of the software mirrors the hardware completely. So don't feel obligated to get the hardware if you're comfortable using a computer and mouse, which is fine. You can also minimize the window and just have a floating remote. And like I mentioned, this mirrors it one-to-one. A right click lets you configure what these buttons do. You can have one of these buttons mute or dim, which is substantially lower the level of the audio. And then there are a few additional profiles here, shortcuts to models here. And then there are a bunch of studio monitor emulations available. These are based on various popular, well-selling speakers. So that's pretty much it for the software and the speakers. Let's talk a bit about pros and cons. On the pros side, first, they sound great, which is probably the most important thing you want. The build seems excellent, and the arc calibration does its job. If you've ever experienced the kind of physical pressure that a heavy bass mode creates in the room, then the correction is kind of like lifting a cloud of mud from your mix. Physically, I think they look and feel good. I also like the slim profile, which clears up valuable desktop real estate. Obviously a major pro, and the reason I made this video is that the room correction technology is built in the speaker, so it's no longer something I have to mess with software and plugins or software running in the background. These truly deliver the promise of DAWless room correction, whether it's audio coming out of your computer or going into a mixer directly into the speakers. It's also nice that you can quickly disable it with a touch of the remote button if you want, or just using the remote in the software. Another pro for the calibration process for these speakers is that it's very fast, especially compared to other plugin solutions that I've used. So if you need to relocate yourself or the speakers in a room, it's pretty quick to get up and running again. It would have been even better if you didn't have to plug the microphone into each of the speakers separately. They're already connected to each other via the TRS cable or USB to a computer. Hopefully that's something they can add in a firmware update. I don't know though. So those are the pros. Basically, you just set it and forget it. On the cons side, obviously there's the price. There are less expensive monitors out there, both with and without room correction. So the main question is, are they worth it? And that's really hard to answer when it comes to speakers. Nothing beats just listening to them in person in comparison to speakers that cost less. Unfortunately, that's not an experience that I can replicate on YouTube. For what it's worth, I'll be using these going forward, so I trust them. Aside from that, I'm hard-pressed to find anything overly negative to say about these monitors. I have a few nitpicky cons. The pucks don't hold on to anything on the bottom, so it's kind of hard to place them correctly under the speakers. And if you need to move the monitors, it's kind of like an awkward process of moving the monitor and then moving the pucks. But it's certainly better to have these included than not. Aside from that, it initially bothered me that there were no power and level controls on the front panel. That said, I've had speakers with both and haven't touched either in quite a while. I use just the audio interface knob to control levels, and the speakers have an auto standby mode, which seems to work well. I do have one feature request for the software and the speakers, I guess, with the remote. I think it would be nice to save multiple calibration profiles. These are intended to be DAWless speakers. The nature of the DAWless beast is that you're not just sitting in the sweet spot, you're playing a synth over here and messing with something over there. It would be nice to be able to store a few positions in the room and quickly swap between them using the remote or the software. The final $10 con for the speakers is that they don't come with a cable, an XLR cable, to connect the microphone to them. So if you do decide to get them, make sure to prepare that in advance. So that's it for the iLoud Precision MTMs. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.